1,184 dead soldiers for every year the siege lasted, 1,000 ships, a decade with no winners and no way home. For 3,000 years, everyone assumed this was just a bedtime story, a poet's fantasy about gods, heroes, and a face that launched a war. Then a stubborn amateur archaeologist blew up a hillside in Turkey with dynamite, and underneath the rubble he found something nobody expected: scorch marks, collapsed walls, a city that had actually burned. This is the story of Troy, the war that mythology swallowed whole, and the war that history quietly gave back. Long before the first spear was thrown on the beaches beneath its walls, Troy was already the kind of city that made other kingdoms nervous. Positioned at the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, in what is now northwestern Turkey, Troy controlled one of the most valuable pieces of geography in the entire Bronze Age world. Every ship moving grain, timber, metal, or slaves between the Aegean world and the resource-rich lands around the Black Sea had to pass close enough to Trojan territory that the city could tax it, control it, or simply take it. Wealth accumulated in Troy the way wealth accumulates at any choke point in a trade network, steadily, visibly, and in a manner that made its neighbors increasingly resentful of a prosperity they had no direct hand in creating. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean Greeks were building their own network of fortified palace kingdoms: Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos, Argos, each ruled by a warrior king, each competing for status, cattle, land, and the kind of glory that Bronze Age aristocracies measured obsessively against one another. These were not unified nations in any modern sense. They were rival courts, bound together loosely by shared language, shared gods, and a code of honor that made insults to one royal house a legitimate concern for all the others, since today's insulted king might be tomorrow's ally against a common enemy, or conversely, today's uninvolved bystander might tomorrow need the very allies he was currently failing to support. The story that Homer's Iliad hands down to us, composed centuries after the events it claims to describe, and shaped by generations of oral retelling before it was ever written down, places the spark of the war in the household of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. His wife, Helen, celebrated across the ancient world as the most beautiful woman alive, left Sparta with a Trojan prince named Paris. Whether by abduction, elopement, or some combination the ancient sources themselves could not agree upon. What is consistent across every version of the story is the outcome. Menelaus's marriage was shattered, his household honor was destroyed in the eyes of every other Greek ruler, and a personal humiliation became, almost overnight, a matter of collective Greek concern. Menelaus turned to his older brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and by most accounts the most powerful ruler in the Greek world at that time. Agamemnon's response drew on an obligation that, according to tradition, every significant Greek suitor for Helen's hand had sworn years earlier, before her marriage to Menelaus had even been decided, an oath binding all of them to defend the marriage, whoever the chosen husband turned out to be, against any future threat to it. This oath, whether historically real or a later narrative device invented to explain why so many independent, competitive kings would ever agree to subordinate themselves to a shared military campaign, gave Agamemnon exactly the legal and social justification he needed to summon an unprecedented coalition of Greek forces under a single banner. It is worth pausing here to consider what modern historians studying this period generally believe was actually driving events, beneath the poetic framing of stolen brides and sworn oaths. Troy's wealth, its control of Black Sea trade access, and its position as an obvious economic rival to Mycenaean interests in the region provide a far more historically plausible explanation for why the most powerful military coalition in the Aegean Bronze Age might commit itself to a 10-year campaign against a single city than any story about a beautiful woman alone could realistically account for. Helen's abduction, in this reading, functioned as the acceptable public justification, the honor-bound casus belli that let ambitious kings dress a war of economic conquest in the more palatable language of righteous vengeance. Whether the underlying spark was personal insult, economic calculation, or some blend of the two that even the participants themselves might not have fully separated in their own minds, the practical result was the same: the largest Greek military mobilization the Bronze Age would ever see. The gathering point for this coalition was the port of Aulis, where somewhere in the range of 100,000 soldiers, a figure historians treat with considerable skepticism given the logistical realities of Bronze Age warfare, but one that nonetheless captures the sheer unprecedented scale the ancient tradition insisted upon, assembled to await favorable winds for the crossing to Troy. It was here, according to the myth, that Agamemnon's ambition ran into its first cost. The winds refused to cooperate, and the prophet Calchas declared that only the sacrifice of Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia, would appease the goddess Artemis and release the fleet to sail. Whatever the historical reality behind this episode, and it is almost certainly a later mythic elaboration rather than a recorded event, its narrative function is unmistakable. It establishes from the very beginning of the story that this war would demand costs disproportionate to any rational calculation of what was actually at stake, and that the men leading it were willing to pay those costs, even in the currency of their own children, rather than turn back. Agamemnon's willingness to sacrifice his daughter for wind and glory sets the moral tone for everything that follows. A decade of war fought by men who had already demonstrated, before a single Trojan had been killed, that honor and ambition would be pursued regardless of the human price attached to them. The fleet that finally sailed from Aulis toward the coast of Anatolia represented, in the tradition Homer inherited and shaped, over 1,000 ships, an image so enduring that the face that launched 1,000 ships became one of the most quoted phrases in the entire Western literary tradition, centuries after anyone still believed the war it referred to had actually happened. What awaited that fleet on the beaches beneath Troy's walls was a city that had spent generations preparing, wittingly or not, for exactly this kind of confrontation: fortified, wealthy, strategically positioned, and defended by a prince whose reputation for courage and honor would prove, over the following decade, to rival anything the Greek camp could produce. It is worth noting how unusual this coalition itself was by the standards of the era it supposedly occurred in. The Mycenaean world that archaeology has reconstructed from palace records, tomb goods, and destroyed fortress sites was one of intensely local, competitive kingship. Rulers who fought each other over cattle raids, border disputes, and dynastic marriages as readily as they cooperated. For dozens of these independent courts to set aside their own rivalries long enough to commit ships, soldiers, and years of their own kingdom's resources to a single overseas campaign would have required either an extraordinarily compelling shared grievance or an extraordinarily compelling shared interest, quite possibly both simultaneously, layered together in the way that human motivations for war usually are. The oath sworn over Helen's hand and the economic opportunity Troy represented were not, in this reading, competing explanations for the war. They were two sides of the same coin: the socially acceptable justification and the underlying material incentive, working together to produce a mobilization no single motive alone could likely have sustained for a full decade of fighting on a foreign shore. The arrival of the Greek fleet at the beaches below Troy represented, by any measure available to Bronze Age warfare, one of the most intimidating amphibious assemblies the ancient Aegean world had ever witnessed. Row upon row of ships beaching along the shoreline, thousands of armed men disembarking in waves, the sheer visual and psychological weight of a coalition drawn from every major Greek kingdom converging on a single target. This was not a raid. This was an existential threat, and the defenders of Troy understood it as such from the moment the first hulls scraped sand. Troy's response was immediate and disciplined. Rather than allowing the Greeks to establish their beachhead unopposed, Trojan forces under the command of Hector, eldest son of King Priam, and by every account that survives from antiquity, the single most respected and morally admirable warrior on either side of the entire conflict, met the invaders directly on the sand. What followed was the kind of brutal, chaotic close-quarters fighting that characterized Bronze Age combat at its most desperate. Men fighting for the immediate, tangible goal of controlling a strip of beach, with the broader strategic questions of the war itself reduced, for those first bloody hours, to the simple binary of holding ground or losing it. The Greeks held. Whatever the precise tactical dynamics of that initial engagement, and Homer's account, composed centuries later and layered with generations of poetic embellishment, cannot be trusted as a precise battlefield record. The strategic outcome is consistent across the tradition. The Greek coalition established its camp on the beach, dug in, and prepared for what its leaders almost certainly expected would be a relatively short campaign against a single, if wealthy, city-state. That expectation collided immediately with the physical reality of Troy's fortifications. The walls of Troy, according to every ancient description, were massive, built to a height and thickness that the siege technology available to Bronze Age Greek armies simply could not overcome through direct assault. There were no siege towers capable of matching those walls, no battering rams with the mechanical sophistication to breach stonework of that scale, no engineering tradition among the Mycenaean Greeks comparable to what later civilizations, particularly the Assyrians and eventually the Macedonians under Alexander, would develop for the specific purpose of breaking fortified cities. Troy's walls were not just an obstacle, they were, for the practical military technology of the era, close to an absolute barrier. Faced with this reality, the Greek coalition's strategic options narrowed to something far less glorious than the pitched battles and individual heroics that would come to dominate the war's later legend. If the walls could not be broken by force, the city would have to be broken by attrition, starved, isolated, and slowly ground down until its population, its resources, or its will to resist finally gave out. This is the strategic logic behind what became a siege lasting, according to the tradition, a full 9 years before the war's climactic 10th-year events that Homer's Iliad actually depicts in detail. The Iliad itself, notably, covers only a matter of weeks, near the war's very end, not the full decade of grinding conflict that supposedly preceded it. 9 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time to sustain a Bronze Age military campaign, and modern historians studying the plausibility of the Homeric tradition have long noted the practical impossibilities this time frame presents. Armies of the scale described could not have realistically remained encamped, static, and idle outside a single city for nearly a decade without either starving themselves, exhausting whatever supply lines connected them to their home kingdoms, or dissolving through desertion and internal conflict long before any resolution was reached. The 9-year siege, as literally described, almost certainly compresses, exaggerates, or mythologizes what was more plausibly a longer pattern of intermittent conflict, seasonal campaigns, periods of standoff, cycles of raiding and retreat, rather than one continuous, unbroken 9-year encirclement. What the tradition does preserve, whatever its literal accuracy, is a coherent and historically plausible picture of how such a protracted conflict would have actually sustained itself, not through the noble sieges of later military history, with supply trains and engineering works, but through systematic raiding of the smaller cities and territories allied with or subject to Troy throughout the surrounding region. Greek forces, unable to feed themselves indefinitely from supplies shipped across the Aegean, turned repeatedly to the plunder of Troy's neighbours and allies, seizing grain, livestock, treasure, and captives from these smaller communities in order to sustain an army that otherwise had no viable long-term logistical foundation for a campaign of this length. This detail, often overshadowed in popular memory by the war's more dramatic single combats and divine interventions, may actually represent one of the more historically credible elements of the entire tradition. Ancient warfare of exactly this kind, extended sieges sustained through the systematic exploitation of a besieged region's periphery, is well documented in other Bronze and Iron Age conflicts across the Eastern Mediterranean. For the ordinary soldiers on both sides, the men whose names Homer never records, who fill the ranks behind Achilles and Hector and Agamemnon, without ever receiving so much as a single line of individual attention, the reality of this extended conflict would have been a grinding, demoralizing existence, bearing little resemblance to the glorious single combats that dominate the poetic tradition. Disease moved efficiently through crowded, unsanitary camps. Malnutrition, psychological exhaustion, and the simple accumulated toll of years spent away from home, family, and any prospect of normal life would have worn down even the most committed warriors. The stalemate at Troy's walls was not, for most of the men who lived through it, an epic. It was an ordeal, and by the time the war finally reached its climactic final year, both sides had been shaped and hardened by nearly a decade of exactly that kind of grinding, unglamorous attrition. There is also the question, rarely addressed directly in the poetic tradition, but impossible to ignore in any honest historical reconstruction, of what a decade-long foreign occupation of this kind would have meant for the smaller communities caught between the two great powers. The cities and villages surrounding Troy that the Greek coalition repeatedly raided for supplies were not neutral bystanders watching a distant conflict unfold. They were the actual population bearing the sustained cost of the war's logistics, their granaries emptied, their livestock seized, their own men killed defending settlements that history would never remember by name, their daughters taken as the very kind of war prizes that would later spark the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles. The Trojan War, viewed from this angle, was never simply a contest between two great powers. It was a decade of continuous violence, radiating outward across an entire region, with Troy and the Greek coalition as its most famous participants, but by no means its only victims. By the 10th year of the siege, the accumulated tension of nearly a decade of stalemate, loss and frustration had worn the Greek coalition down to something considerably less unified than the confident alliance that had assembled at Aulis. Kings who had sworn to fight together under Agamemnon's overall command had spent years watching their soldiers die for incremental gains, watching plunder raids substitute for the decisive victory that had originally seemed so achievable, and watching the personal rivalries and resentments that inevitably accumulate among proud, ambitious men forced into years of close, stressful cooperation begin to fray the coalition's underlying cohesion. That fraying reached its breaking point in a conflict between Agamemnon, the supreme commander of the Greek forces, and Achilles, the single most feared and effective warrior in the entire coalition. Achilles' reputation rested on a combination of raw battlefield ability and something approaching genuine invincibility in the eyes of both allies and enemies. Whatever the literal truth behind the later legend of his singular vulnerable heel, the tradition consistently presents him as a warrior whose presence on the battlefield alone could determine the outcome of an engagement, a man other soldiers, on both sides, genuinely feared to face directly. The specific spark of the quarrel, as Homer's Iliad presents it, was a dispute over captured war prizes, specifically a woman named Briseis, taken as spoils of war during one of the coalition's raids on Troy's allied territories, and awarded to Achilles as his personal share of the plunder, in keeping with the customary distribution of spoils that governed Bronze Age warfare. When Agamemnon was forced to surrender his own captured woman, Chryseis, in order to appease the god Apollo and end a plague he had brought down on the Greek camp, Agamemnon responded by exercising his authority as supreme commander to claim Briseis from Achilles as compensation for his own loss. This might read, to modern sensibilities, as a relatively minor administrative dispute over the distribution of captured spoils. Within the honor-obsessed value system of Bronze Age Greek aristocratic culture, however, it represented something far more serious. A direct assertion of Agamemnon's authority over Achilles. A public demonstration that even the coalition's greatest warrior could be stripped of his rightfully earned prize by a commander who outranked him in title but, in the judgment of many including Achilles himself, not in actual military value or battlefield contribution. Honor in this cultural framework was not an abstract sentiment, it was a tangible, measurable quantity. And Agamemnon's action represented a calculated and deeply personal insult to Achilles' standing among his peers. Achilles' response was to withdraw entirely from combat, retreating to his tent and refusing to commit his forces to the ongoing siege, effectively removing the coalition's single most valuable military asset from the field at a moment when the war's fortunes were already precarious after years of stalemate. This was not merely sulking. Within the value system that governed these relationships, it represented a legitimate and devastating form of protest, a demonstration, through withdrawal, of exactly how dependent the entire coalition's military fortunes had become on the contribution of a single warrior whose value Agamemnon had just publicly failed to properly respect. The consequences were immediate and severe. With Achilles and his elite Myrmidon forces withdrawn from the fighting, Hector and the Trojan forces seized the opportunity his absence provided, launching an increasingly aggressive counteroffensive that drove Greek forces back from whatever ground they had gained over the preceding years, pushing the coalition literally back to the beaches where the war had begun a decade earlier. Trojan forces began setting fire to the beached Greek ships, an assault that carried existential stakes far beyond any single tactical engagement, since the destruction of the fleet would have stranded the entire Greek coalition on hostile shores with no viable path home. Greek emissaries, dispatched by an increasingly desperate Agamemnon, approached Achilles with lavish offers of compensation: gold, additional captured women, formal public acknowledgement of the wrong done to him, and various other concessions calculated to restore his honor and induce him back into the fighting. Achilles, in one of the more psychologically complex moments the Iliad preserves, refused every offer. His anger, by this point, had moved beyond a grievance that material compensation could resolve. He had, in effect, begun questioning the entire value system that had brought him to this war in the first place. A war being fought, from his increasingly disillusioned perspective, for another man's stolen wife and another king's ambition, at the cost of years of his own life and the lives of the men who served under him. This standoff, a coalition on the brink of catastrophic military collapse, its greatest warrior refusing every attempt at reconciliation, its ships under active threat of destruction, represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated episodes in the entire tradition, and one that later literary and historical analysis has consistently identified as far more than a simple story about wounded pride. It is, at its core, a meditation on the relationship between individual honor and collective military necessity, between personal grievance and communal survival, themes that would recur throughout the subsequent history of military leadership and coalition warfare for millennia after the Trojan War itself had faded into legend. The Greek coalition, for all its numbers and all its accumulated years of siege warfare, discovered in this moment that its actual military effectiveness rested disproportionately on the willing participation of a single deeply aggrieved man, and no amount of gold or diplomatic pressure from Agamemnon could force that willing participation back into existence. What finally would break this impasse was not diplomacy, but personal tragedy, a death that would prove far more persuasive than any offer of treasure. Watching the Greek coalition's forces pushed back to the very edge of the sea, their ships under direct threat of the fire that would strand the entire expedition on hostile shores, was more than Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, described throughout the tradition with a depth of personal intimacy that later Greek and Roman commentators would debate at length, could bear in silence. Where Achilles remained unmoved by gold, status, and the pleas of kings, Patroclus' own conscience and loyalty to the broader Greek cause proved far less resistant to the unfolding catastrophe he was witnessing. Patroclus approached Achilles not with demands, but with a direct, personal appeal. If Achilles himself would not return to the fighting, would he at least permit Patroclus to lead the elite Myrmidon soldiers back into battle, wearing Achilles' own distinctive armor, in order to trick the Trojan forces into believing that Achilles himself had rejoined the war? The psychological calculation behind this request was sound and historically plausible within the honor and reputation-driven warfare of the period. Achilles' mere presence on the battlefield, real or convincingly simulated, carried enough psychological weight among Trojan forces that even the appearance of his return might be sufficient to break their momentum and drive them back from the beleaguered Greek ships. Achilles agreed, but with an explicit and pointed condition that would prove to carry enormous tragic weight in retrospect. Patroclus was authorized only to drive Trojan forces away from the immediate threat to the ships, and then return, under no circumstances pursuing the retreating Trojans back toward the city itself, or engaging Hector in anything resembling a prolonged, decisive confrontation. Achilles understood something about the specific danger Hector represented that he wanted Patroclus to respect absolutely. A recognition, embedded in the narrative structure of the story itself, that borrowed glory and borrowed armor could carry a man only so far before the underlying reality of who was actually wearing that armor became a matter of life and death. The initial results of this deception proved every bit as effective as Patroclus had calculated. The sight of Achilles' unmistakable armor returning to the battlefield produced genuine panic among Trojan forces who had, for however many days Achilles' absence had lasted, begun to believe the war's fundamental balance of power had shifted in their favor. That confidence collapsed the moment the borrowed armor appeared on the field. Patroclus, fighting with a combination of genuine skill and the psychological advantage his disguise provided, drove Trojan forces back from the ships with considerable success, reportedly killing dozens of enemy soldiers in the process and achieving exactly the tactical objective Achilles had authorized. It was at precisely this moment of genuine triumph that Patroclus made the fatal decision that Achilles' explicit instructions had been designed to prevent. Caught up in the momentum of his own success, in the intoxicating rush of battlefield victory after witnessing years of grinding stalemate, Patroclus abandoned the careful limits Achilles had placed on his engagement and pursued the retreating Trojan forces directly to the base of the city's own walls. Precisely the kind of overreach that transformed a limited tactical victory into a direct confrontation with the single most dangerous warrior on the Trojan side. Hector met him there. What followed was not, according to the tradition, an entirely fair fight. The god Apollo, according to the mythic framework the story operates within, intervened directly to strip Patroclus of his borrowed armor's protective advantages at the critical moment, leaving him exposed and vulnerable precisely when Hector's spear found its mark. Whatever the historical reality obscured beneath this divine intervention, and it likely represents a narrative device explaining, in terms comprehensible to its original audience, how even a warrior fighting with Achilles' own equipment and considerable skill of his own could nonetheless fall to Hector in single combat. The outcome was unambiguous. Patroclus died on the field, and Hector, in a further act calculated to maximize the humiliation of the Greek loss, stripped Achilles' distinctive armor from the body and claimed it as his own trophy, wearing it as a visible, deliberately provocative symbol of his victory. The strategic and psychological consequences of Patroclus' death would prove to be the single most consequential turning point in the entire war. Achilles' withdrawal from combat, which had persisted through every previous attempt at reconciliation, gold, status, formal apology, the direct pleas of Agamemnon and his fellow kings, dissolved instantly and completely the moment news of his closest companion's death reached him. Every calculation of honor, every grievance about stolen prizes and wounded pride that had kept the coalition's greatest warrior on the sidelines for so long became utterly irrelevant in the face of personal loss on this scale. What material compensation, diplomatic appeals, and the collective survival of the entire Greek expedition had failed to accomplish, a single death accomplished instantly and completely. It returned Achilles to the war, and it returned him transformed into something considerably more dangerous than the aggrieved warrior who had withdrawn from the fighting weeks earlier. The Achilles who returned to combat following Patroclus' death bore only a superficial resemblance to the warrior who had, until that moment, been sulking in his tent over a dispute about captured spoils and wounded honor. Grief, in the psychological framework the ancient tradition presents, had transformed personal anger into something closer to a consuming, almost inhuman rage, a state in which the careful calculations of honor, status, and diplomatic negotiation that had governed his previous conduct in the war simply ceased to apply. Agamemnon's earlier insult, which had seemed so unforgivable that no amount of gold or status could compensate for it, became instantly and completely irrelevant. Achilles' fury now had a single, overwhelming target: Troy itself, and everyone associated with the death of his closest companion. Equipped with new armor, forged, according to the mythic tradition, by the god Hephaestus himself at the request of Achilles' divine mother Thetis, replacing the armor Hector had stripped from Patroclus' body, Achilles returned to the battlefield in a state that the ancient sources describe with language suggesting something approaching a berserker rage, a warrior operating beyond the normal constraints of even Bronze Age battlefield conduct. The scale and intensity of the killing that followed, as described in the tradition, exceeds anything else recorded in the entire war, with ancient accounts describing Trojan forces cut down in numbers so significant that the nearby Scamander River itself supposedly became choked with bodies, its waters reportedly running red and its flow obstructed by the accumulated dead. Whatever literal credence one gives to this specific detail, and it almost certainly represents poetic exaggeration rather than a literal historical account, its narrative function is unmistakable. It communicates, in the most visceral terms available to the storytelling tradition, the sheer scale of devastation Achilles' grief-fueled return to combat unleashed on Trojan forces. Soldiers who had, only days earlier, been pushing the Greek coalition back to its ships in a moment of genuine battlefield confidence, now found themselves fleeing in open, uncontrolled panic before a single warrior whose reputation alone had, in earlier phases of the war, been sufficient to shape battlefield outcomes even without direct engagement. Trojan forces retreated behind their walls in what the tradition presents as a near-total rout. With one significant and deliberate exception, Hector himself remained outside the gates, refusing to retreat into the relative safety of the fortified city alongside his fleeing countrymen. This decision, whatever its precise historical or narrative motivations, carries enormous symbolic weight within the story's broader moral architecture. Hector's own parents, Priam and Hecuba, are depicted calling down to him from the walls, begging him to abandon his position and retreat to safety rather than face Achilles in the state of consuming rage he had clearly entered. Hector, understanding with apparent clarity exactly what confronting Achilles under these circumstances likely meant for his own survival, nonetheless chose to remain and face the confrontation directly, a choice the tradition frames explicitly in terms of honor. Better to die facing the enemy than to survive by fleeing before the eyes of the people who depended on him for their protection. When the moment of actual confrontation arrived, however, even Hector's carefully cultivated courage briefly failed him. Confronted with the sight of Achilles approaching in his new armor, radiating the kind of unrestrained battlefield fury that had already devastated the Trojan ranks, Hector broke and fled, not toward the safety of the city gates, but in a desperate circuit around the entire perimeter of Troy's walls, with Achilles in direct pursuit. The tradition describes this pursuit continuing for 3 full circuits of the city before Hector, exhausted and apparently recognizing the futility of continued flight, finally turned to face his pursuer directly. This moment of Hector's fear, so strikingly at odds with the courage and moral steadiness that defines his character throughout the rest of the tradition, deserves particular attention precisely because of how unusual it is within the broader heroic framework the story otherwise maintains. Homer's presentation of Hector consistently emphasizes his humanity in ways that distinguish him from many of the more purely heroic figures on the Greek side. Hector is depicted as a devoted husband, a loving father, a man who fights not for personal glory, but out of genuine obligation to defend his city and his family. His momentary flight from Achilles, followed by his ultimate decision to turn and face a confrontation he almost certainly recognized as unwinnable, presents a portrait of courage that is not the fearless heroism of demigods, but something closer to the more relatable courage of an ordinary man choosing to face mortal danger despite his very human fear of it. The confrontation that finally occurred between the 2 men, after this extended and psychologically fraught pursuit, would determine not just the immediate military balance of the war, but the ultimate fate of Troy itself, since Hector's death would remove the single most capable defender the city possessed, and leave its remaining forces facing an increasingly desperate strategic position against an enemy whose greatest warrior had now been fully, irreversibly returned to the fighting by a grief that showed no signs of abating. There is a particular cruelty embedded in the structure of this confrontation that later commentators, from ancient Greek tragedians through modern literary scholars, have consistently returned to. Hector was, by every measure the tradition itself provides, fighting a war he had never wanted and could not have prevented. He had counseled caution repeatedly throughout the conflict, had criticized his own brother Paris's role in provoking it, and remained bound to the city's defense not by personal grievance or ambition, but by simple, inescapable duty as Troy's crown prince and its most capable soldier. Achilles, by contrast, fought a war whose original cause, another man's wife, meant essentially nothing to him personally, and had spent weeks of the war's final year refusing to fight in it at all over a matter of personal honor entirely disconnected from Troy's actual survival. That these 2 men, representing such fundamentally different relationships to the same conflict, would ultimately meet in a duel that neither had any real choice about entering, captures something the entire tradition seems determined to communicate. War consumes the dutiful and the reluctant alongside the glory-seeking, and rarely distinguishes between them when the moment of actual combat finally arrives. The single combat between Achilles and Hector, when it finally occurred at the conclusion of that desperate 3-circuit pursuit around Troy's walls, has become one of the most enduring images in the entire Western literary tradition. 2 men, representing fundamentally different relationships to the war they had both been drawn into, facing each other in a confrontation whose outcome the poem's audience, and likely Hector himself, already understood to be effectively predetermined. Achilles possessed an advantage beyond mere battlefield skill or the psychological momentum of his grief-fueled fury. Specific, detailed knowledge of the armor Hector was wearing, since it was, after all, the same armor Hector had stripped from Patroclus's body following the earlier engagement, armor originally belonging to Achilles himself. This intimate familiarity gave Achilles precise knowledge of the armor's construction, and specifically, its vulnerabilities, the points at which its protective coverage was incomplete, where a well-placed strike might find flesh rather than bronze. When the two men finally engaged in direct combat, Achilles used exactly this knowledge, driving his spear through a gap at Hector's throat, one of the few points the armor left exposed, delivering a wound that proved immediately fatal. Hector, according to the tradition, used his final words not to plead for his own life, but to make a specific, deeply culturally significant request, that his body be returned to his family for proper burial rites, rather than left exposed or desecrated, a request rooted in the Bronze Age Greek and broader ancient Mediterranean understanding that proper funeral rites were essential not merely as an expression of grief, but as a genuine spiritual and religious necessity, without which the dead could not properly pass into whatever afterlife their culture's beliefs promised them. Achilles' response to this dying request reveals the full extent of how thoroughly his grief over Patroclus had reshaped his moral conduct. He refused. Not only did he deny Hector's final wish, he compounded the refusal with an act of deliberate, sustained desecration that shocked even the value system of Bronze Age heroic culture, a culture that was hardly squeamish about battlefield brutality, but that nonetheless maintained strong customary expectations about the proper treatment of a defeated enemy's remains. Achilles pierced Hector's ankles, threaded a cord through the wounds, and bound the body to his chariot, then drove around the walls of Troy, dragging Hector's corpse behind him in full view of the city's grieving population, including, according to the tradition, Hector's own wife and elderly parents, watching from the walls as their husband, son, and city's greatest defender was subjected to this calculated humiliation. This was not a single act, but a sustained one. Achilles reportedly repeated this desecration daily for multiple days, dragging Hector's body around Patroclus's funeral mound each morning in a ritualized display of ongoing, unresolved grief and rage that showed no sign of abating through the normal mechanisms. Vengeance achieved, enemy defeated, that might otherwise have been expected to satisfy it. The ancient tradition, notably, includes a detail suggesting that even the gods found this conduct excessive. Divine intervention, according to the mythic framework, preserved Hector's body from the physical decay and disfigurement that dragging it repeatedly across rough ground should have inflicted, an implicit narrative judgment that Achilles' grief had carried him past the boundaries of acceptable conduct, even within a culture that placed enormous value on vengeance and honor. This episode functions, within the broader structure of the story, as a meditation on the corrosive and ultimately self-destructive nature of unchecked grief and rage, even when that grief stems from genuine, understandable loss. Achilles' treatment of Hector's body accomplishes nothing of practical military or strategic value. It does not restore Patroclus to life, does not meaningfully improve the Greek coalition's position in the ongoing siege, and does not even provide Achilles himself with any evident emotional resolution, given that he continues the desecration for days without apparent diminishment of his fury. It is, in the story's moral framework, an act that reveals the specific danger of a warrior culture's core values: honor, vengeance, glory. Taken to their logical extreme, stripped of the countervailing considerations of mercy, proportion, and respect for a defeated enemy's basic humanity that might otherwise have tempered them. The resolution of this particular crisis, when it finally arrived, would come not through further violence but through one of the most emotionally sophisticated and genuinely moving episodes in the entire ancient literary tradition. A confrontation not between warriors on a battlefield, but between an aging, grieving father and the man who had killed his son, meeting in circumstances that neither honor, nor vengeance, nor the accumulated momentum of a decade of warfare could have predicted would ever occur. King Priam of Troy, elderly, grieving, and watching his city's fortunes deteriorate with the loss of its most capable defender, made a decision in the aftermath of Hector's death that required a form of courage entirely different from anything demonstrated on the battlefield throughout the preceding years of warfare. Under cover of darkness, accompanied by only a herald and guided, according to the mythic tradition, by the god Hermes disguised as a mortal escort, Priam left the relative safety of Troy's walls and made his way directly into the heart of the Greek camp, into the tent of Achilles himself, the man who had killed his son and had spent the subsequent days subjecting that son's body to deliberate, sustained desecration. This was an act of almost incomprehensible personal risk. Priam was placing himself directly and voluntarily into the power of a warrior whose grief-fueled rage had already demonstrated its capacity for conduct well outside normal wartime restraint. There was no guarantee, and every reasonable expectation to the contrary, that Achilles might simply kill the aging king on sight, or hold him for ransom, or subject him to some further humiliation calculated to extend the psychological punishment he had already been inflicting on Hector's memory and on the city watching from its walls. What actually occurred according to the tradition Homer's Iliad preserves in one of its most psychologically sophisticated and enduringly powerful passages was something considerably more complex than either violence or simple negotiation. Priam entered Achilles' tent and, in a gesture of complete and deliberate self-abasement, entirely without precedent for a reigning king addressing another mortal, knelt before Achilles and kissed the hands that had killed his son, the specific hands responsible for Hector's death, offered this gesture of supplication not out of any expectation that it would be well received, but because he had run out of other options, and because his grief for his son had carried him past any calculation of personal dignity or royal status. Priam's appeal to Achilles, as the tradition presents it, was not primarily an argument about justice, honor, or the proper conduct of war. It was an appeal to shared, universal human experience. Priam asked Achilles to think of his own father, an old man far away in Greece, who was, in all likelihood, thinking constantly of his son and hoping for his safe return from this war that had already consumed a decade of both their lives. Priam explicitly drew the parallel between himself and Achilles' own father, positioning his grief not as the specific grief of a Trojan king mourning a Trojan prince, but as the universal grief of any father who has lost, or fears losing, a son to violence, a grief that transcended the immediate political and military conflict separating the two men, and appealed instead to something Achilles could recognize in his own relationship with his own aging father. This appeal succeeded in a way that gold, status, and the collective pleading of the entire Greek coalition, offered weeks earlier in an attempt to end Achilles' withdrawal from combat, had entirely failed to achieve. Something in Priam's specific framing, not a demand, not an attempt at negotiation, but a direct appeal to shared human vulnerability and loss, broke through the consuming rage that had governed Achilles' conduct since Patroclus' death. The two men, according to the tradition, wept together in that tent, Priam for Hector, and for the son he had already lost, Achilles for Patroclus, and, the text suggests, for his own father, whom he would likely never see again given his own foreknowledge, embedded throughout the broader mythic tradition, that he was fated to die at Troy before the war's conclusion. This shared grief accomplished what nothing else in the entire war had managed. It produced a moment of genuine, if temporary, reconciliation between two men who represented opposing sides of a conflict that had already cost both of them everything they valued most. Achilles agreed to release Hector's body to his father, ending the sustained desecration that had shocked even the gods, according to the tradition's own internal moral framework. He further agreed to a formal 12-day truce, allowing Troy the time necessary to conduct Hector's funeral with the full rites and ceremony that his status as the city's greatest warrior and Priam's eldest son demanded. Hector's funeral, which occupies the concluding passage of Homer's Iliad itself, the poem notably ends here, well before the war's actual conclusion, having told the story it set out to tell about wrath, grief, and reconciliation, without ever depicting Troy's eventual fall, is described with the kind of elaborate, sustained ceremonial detail that emphasizes the genuine communal loss his death represented for the entire city. But the truce, and the funeral it enabled, represented only a pause, not a resolution. Both sides, exhausted by a decade of warfare, and now further transformed by the personal losses and reconciliations of these final weeks, understood implicitly that the underlying conflict remained entirely unresolved, and that fighting would inevitably resume once the ceremonial obligations of Hector's funeral had been properly observed. The war that resumed following the conclusion of Hector's funeral truce brought fresh combatants into a conflict that had, by this point, already ground down an entire decade's worth of ambition, honor, and human life. Among the most notable of these late additions to the fighting was a contingent of Amazon warriors, according to the broader mythic tradition surrounding the war, a detail that later classical commentators treated with varying degrees of literal credence, but one that nonetheless reflects the tradition's consistent tendency to escalate the scale and drama of the conflict's final phases as it approached its ultimate, catastrophic conclusion. Throughout these final stages of the war, Achilles remained the single most dominant and feared warrior on the field, his battlefield effectiveness undiminished by the personal transformation his grief over Patroclus had produced. He continued to function as the Greek coalition's primary military asset, the warrior whose presence alone could determine the outcome of engagements that might otherwise have gone very differently. But the broader mythic tradition surrounding the Trojan War had, since long before the events depicted in the Iliad itself, established that Achilles was fated to die at Troy, a foreknowledge that both the character himself and the story's original audience carried throughout the narrative, lending his continued battlefield heroism a quality of foreshadowed, inevitable tragedy that colors every one of his actions in the war's concluding phases. The specific circumstances of Achilles' death, as preserved across various sources beyond the Iliad itself, since Homer's poem, as noted, concludes before the war's actual end, involve Paris, the Trojan prince whose actions in taking Helen from Sparta had originally provided the war's precipitating cause. Paris himself was not, by any account, a warrior of particular skill or reputation in direct combat. His role throughout the broader tradition is consistently that of a figure whose personal choices carried enormous consequences without his ever demonstrating the martial prowess of figures like Hector or Achilles. It is a detail worth noting for its narrative irony. The man whose actions started the war would also, according to the tradition, be responsible for ending the life of its single greatest warrior, not through skill in direct combat, but through a single, carefully aimed shot from a distance. Paris's arrow, guided according to the mythic tradition by the direct intervention of the god Apollo, struck Achilles in the heel, the specific location that later tradition would immortalize as the sole point of vulnerability on a body otherwise rendered invulnerable through his mother Thetis's efforts to protect him in infancy, dipping the infant Achilles into the river Styx while holding him by the heel, the one part of his body the protective waters never touched. This is the origin of Achilles' heel, as a phrase that has entered common usage across virtually every language influenced by Western literary tradition, describing any critical point of vulnerability in an otherwise formidable strength, a testament to just how thoroughly this particular detail of the Trojan War's mythology has permeated cultural memory even among people with no broader familiarity with the war's events. The death of a warrior whose battlefield reputation had, by this point in the war, become the single most significant factor shaping the conflict's overall military balance, represented a catastrophic blow to Greek coalition morale and strategic prospects. Fighting reportedly erupted over control of Achilles' body, with Greek forces determined to recover both his corpse and his famous armor for proper funeral rites, understanding the symbolic and practical importance of ensuring their greatest warrior received appropriate honors rather than allowing Trojan forces to claim his remains. Achilles' armor, following his funeral, was awarded to Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, whose reputation throughout the tradition rests not on raw battlefield prowess in the manner of Achilles or Hector, but on cunning, strategic intelligence, and the kind of creative problem-solving that would prove, in the war's final and most consequential episode, to be exactly what the exhausted Greek coalition needed after a decade of warfare had otherwise produced only stalemate, grief, and mounting losses on both sides. With Achilles dead, and a full decade of siege warfare having produced no decisive breakthrough against Troy's still intact walls, the Greek coalition faced a genuine strategic crisis. Direct military force, even backed by the greatest individual warrior of the age, had proven insufficient to break Troy's defences. The soldiers who had left their homes 10 years earlier, many of them now approaching middle age or beyond, faced the increasingly humiliating prospect of returning home, if they returned at all, without ever having achieved the decisive victory that had originally seemed, in the confident early days of the campaign, to be well within reach. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion, frustration, and dwindling strategic options that Odysseus would propose the plan that finally brought the war to its conclusion, not through further battlefield heroics, but through deception, patience, and a wooden horse that would become, alongside the Achilles heel, one of the most enduring images in the entire history of human storytelling. The broader tradition surrounding this final phase of the war also preserves a detail worth pausing on. Even the manner in which Achilles' own armor was awarded became a source of fresh conflict within the Greek camp, with the warrior Ajax, who had also fought fiercely to recover Achilles' body from the battlefield, reportedly considering himself the more deserving recipient and descending, according to some versions of the tradition, into a rage and eventual suicide over the perceived slight of losing the honor to Odysseus instead. Whatever the precise historical plausibility of this specific episode, its persistence within the broader tradition reflects something the war's storytellers seem determined to keep returning to throughout the entire narrative: that the coalition fighting at Troy was never a fully unified force bound by shared purpose alone, but a collection of proud, competitive men whose internal rivalries over honor, prizes, and recognition repeatedly threatened to undo them from within, even as they continued, year after year, to hold together just enough to keep the siege alive. The strategy Odysseus proposed to his fellow Greek commanders, after a decade of siege warfare had exhausted every conventional military option available to the coalition, was audacious precisely because it abandoned the direct military approach that had failed for 10 straight years, in favor of something that depended entirely on psychology, deception, and Trojan religious belief, rather than on force of arms. If Troy's walls could not be broken by siege engines, battering rams, or the individual heroics of warriors like Achilles, then perhaps the city could be persuaded to break its own defenses voluntarily, by convincing its population to willingly bring an armed threat directly inside their own walls. The plan required the Greek coalition to construct a massive hollow wooden horse, built, according to the tradition, from timber salvaged from their own ships, an image carrying its own symbolic weight, since it meant literally dismantling part of the fleet that had carried them to Troy in order to build the instrument that would finally bring the war to its end. A select group of the coalition's most capable and disciplined warriors, including Odysseus himself according to most versions of the tradition, concealed themselves within the horse's hollow interior, remaining motionless and silent for what would need to be an extended and physically demanding wait, dependent entirely on the plan's psychological premise actually working as intended. The remainder of the Greek forces then executed the second half of the deception, burning their camp, boarding their remaining ships, and sailing away from Troy's shores in a manner calculated to convince Trojan observers that the coalition had finally, after 10 years of fruitless siege, given up and returned home. This departure was not a genuine retreat. The fleet, according to the tradition, sailed only as far as the nearby island of Tenedos, remaining close enough to return quickly once the second phase of the plan had run its course, but far enough to convincingly disappear from the immediate view of anyone watching from Troy's walls. Left behind deliberately was a single Greek soldier named Sinon, whose specific task was to be discovered by Trojan forces and to provide, through a carefully constructed false account, the explanation that would convince the city to bring the wooden horse inside its own walls. Sinon's story, as the tradition presents it, claimed that he had been abandoned by his own comrades, marked for human sacrifice but having escaped that fate, and that the wooden horse itself represented a religious offering to the goddess Athena, constructed specifically to ensure the Greek fleet's safe passage home across the sea. Crucially, Sinon's account suggested that the horse had been built to a scale deliberately too large to fit through Troy's gates, specifically to prevent the Trojans from bringing it inside their walls and thereby claiming its divine protective favor for themselves, rather than allowing it to accompany the departing Greek fleet. This detail, the suggestion that the horse was deliberately built to be too large for Troy's gates, represents a particularly sophisticated piece of psychological manipulation, since it transformed what should have been an obviously suspicious gift from a defeated and departing enemy into an object of competitive religious desire. If the Greeks had specifically designed the horse to prevent Trojan access to its supposed divine favor, then bringing it inside the city despite that obstacle became, in the psychological logic Sinon's story constructed, a form of triumph over the very enemy who had tried to deny them that favor. The Trojan response to this deception was not, according to the tradition, universal or uncritical. Multiple figures within the city expressed genuine skepticism about the wisdom of bringing an unexplained wooden structure inside their own walls after a decade of warfare with an enemy who had just demonstrated, across 10 years of conflict, considerable capacity for tactical deception and creative problem-solving. The priest Laocoon, in one of the tradition's most dramatically rendered warnings, explicitly cautioned against trusting the apparent gift, reportedly declaring some version of the now proverbial warning to beware of Greeks bearing gifts, and even, according to some versions of the story, hurling a spear into the horse's flank to test its contents, an act that, had it been heeded or investigated further, might have exposed the entire deception before it could succeed. Laocoon's warnings, however, were undermined by what the tradition presents as direct divine intervention. Sea serpents, sent according to the mythic framework by gods favoring the Greek cause, emerged and killed Laocoon and his sons in full view of the assembled Trojan population, an event the city interpreted not as a warning to be heeded, but as evidence that Laocoon himself had offended the gods by opposing what was, in this newly persuasive interpretation, clearly a legitimate and sacred offering. Whatever the underlying historical reality this episode may or may not reflect, its narrative function within the tradition is to explain why an otherwise reasonable warning offered by a figure with genuine religious authority within the city, was ultimately disregarded by a population whose judgment had already been compromised by 10 years of accumulated exhaustion, desperate hope for the war's end, and susceptibility to exactly the kind of psychological manipulation Sinon's account had been carefully constructed to exploit. Convinced by Sinon's story, and further persuaded by what appeared to be unmistakable divine punishment of the one voice raised in serious opposition, the population of Troy made the fateful decision to dismantle a portion of their own defensive wall in order to bring the oversized horse inside the city, celebrating what they believed was the end of a war that had consumed a full decade of their lives, with a night of feasting and celebration that would leave the city's defenses and its population's collective vigilance at their absolute lowest point in the entire 10-year conflict. The celebration that swept through Troy on what its population believed was the first night of genuine peace in a full decade proved to be the precise condition the Greek deception had been engineered to exploit. As the city's residents drank, feasted, and finally allowed themselves the kind of unguarded relief that 10 years of continuous military threat had made impossible, the concealed Greek warriors inside the wooden horse waited for exactly this moment of maximum vulnerability, when wine, exhaustion, and the psychological release of believing the war had finally ended would leave the city's defenses at their weakest point since the siege had first begun. Under cover of darkness, once the celebrations had given way to the deep, wine-soaked sleep of a population that believed itself finally safe, the hidden Greek soldiers emerged from the horse's hollow interior. Their first and most critical task was to silently eliminate whatever watchmen remained at their posts and to open Troy's main gates from the inside, the specific vulnerability the entire deception had been designed to create, since no amount of Greek military force positioned outside the walls could have breached Troy's fortifications directly, but a city that had voluntarily opened its own gates presented an entirely different strategic situation. The signal given, the Greek fleet, which had never actually sailed home, but had remained concealed just offshore at Tenedos throughout the preceding hours, returned under cover of the same darkness and landed its full remaining force on the beaches below Troy for the final time in the war's 10-year history. Pouring through the gates that their concealed comrades had opened from within, Greek forces entered a city whose population remained largely unaware, still deep in the exhausted sleep of celebration, that their supposed victory had been, from the very beginning, an elaborate trap. What followed, according to every surviving account of the war's conclusion, was a massacre conducted with a level of violence that exceeded even the accumulated brutality of the preceding decade of open warfare. Trojan soldiers, caught unarmed and disoriented in the chaos of a surprise night assault, were killed in overwhelming numbers, with the tradition specifically noting that neither the sanctuary of temples nor any other conventional wartime consideration for non-combatants provided meaningful protection once the killing began. King Priam himself, the same elderly monarch whose desperate, courageous journey into Achilles' tent had produced one of the war's few genuine moments of shared humanity and reconciliation, was killed at his own household altar, a death the tradition presents with particular emphasis on its brutality and its violation of the most basic expectations of sanctuary and mercy that even Bronze Age warfare was generally understood to observe. The women and children of Troy who survived the initial slaughter faced the fate that ancient warfare consistently imposed on the populations of conquered cities: enslavement, the systematic destruction of whatever remained of their former lives and status, and forced integration into the households and territories of the very soldiers who had just killed their husbands, fathers, and sons. The city itself, according to the tradition, was thoroughly looted and then burned, its structures reduced to the kind of ash and rubble that would, millennia later, provide the physical evidence that transformed this entire story from poetic legend into a subject of genuine historical and archaeological investigation. Menelaus, whose wife's departure with Paris had originally provided the war's precipitating justification, finally recovered Helen amid the chaos of the city's fall. The tradition preserves a detail worth noting for what it reveals about the story's underlying psychological complexity, even at its violent conclusion. Menelaus reportedly approached the reunion, prepared to kill Helen for the humiliation and decade of warfare her departure had caused, only to find his resolve dissolve entirely at the sight of her. Whatever combination of enduring attraction, complicated love, and sheer exhaustion after 10 years of war, ultimately proving stronger than his anger. For nearly 3,000 years following whatever historical kernel of truth may have originally inspired it, the Trojan War existed in cultural memory as exactly the kind of story its increasingly skeptical modern readers assumed it to be. A magnificent, emotionally powerful, but ultimately fictional epic, composed by Homer and elaborated by generations of subsequent poets and playwrights, containing gods, monsters, semi-divine heroes, and a narrative scale that seemed to belong more properly to the realm of myth than to any genuine historical event. Serious scholars throughout the 18th and much of the 19th century generally treated Troy itself as a purely literary invention, a setting with no more historical reality than Olympus, or the underworld that also feature throughout the same broader mythic tradition. This scholarly consensus was overturned by Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy, largely self-taught German businessman turned amateur archaeologist whose methods were, by the standards of professional archaeology even in his own era, crude and in some respects genuinely destructive. His excavation techniques, which reportedly included the use of dynamite to clear through overlying strata in his determination to reach what he believed were the war's actual historical layers, damaged and destroyed archaeological evidence that more careful methods might have preserved. Despite these serious methodological failures, Schliemann's excavations at the site of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, beginning in the 1870s, uncovered the physical remains of an actual fortified Bronze Age city, one that had unmistakably been destroyed by fire, with archaeological layers showing evidence consistent with violent conflict at approximately the time period the broader Greek tradition associated with the Trojan War. Subsequent, far more careful and methodologically rigorous excavations conducted throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have refined and considerably complicated Schliemann's initial, often overconfident conclusions, but the core discovery has held. Troy was a real place, a genuinely wealthy and strategically significant Bronze Age city, occupying exactly the geographic position the ancient tradition described. And the archaeological record does show evidence of violent destruction, consistent with warfare during the broader historical period the Trojan War tradition claims. Whether the specific causes were a stolen queen, a trade war, a geopolitical rivalry between Bronze Age powers, or some combination the ancient poets compressed and transformed into more dramatically satisfying terms, the fundamental premise that a real war was fought over a real city, and that this war left a lasting enough impression to be preserved, elaborated, and transmitted across 3,000 years of human storytelling, has been vindicated by the patient, physical evidence of stone, ash, and fire-scarred earth that Schliemann's dynamite first exposed, however clumsily, to modern eyes. What remains, in the end, is a story that has survived every test 3,000 years of human skepticism could throw at it, dismissed as pure invention, reclaimed as buried history, picked apart by archaeologists, and reassembled by novelists, filmmakers, and podcasters in every generation since. The gods, the sea serpents, and the singular vulnerable heel almost certainly belong to the realm of myth. But the wall did fall, the fire did burn, and somewhere beneath a hillside in modern Turkey, The ash of a real Bronze Age city still holds the physical memory of whatever war, whatever grievance, whatever decade of grinding human cost actually took place there, long before Homer's poets ever turned it into a story about heroes.